In this episode, I'm going to set the bar straight on the highly controversial subject, are deep squats bad for your knees? Let's find out.
I want you to have the capability to fully move the way your body was designed to, right?
Jump of the head, I'll take you back to where my problems lie. In trouble, younger daughter done some that made my mama cry. Out to the heavens like I bless him, for I know he's lost. Caught in a trance and his manic depression settled in. Living in the fantasy.
Hey, what's up everybody? I'm Dr. Horschig and this is episode 23 of the Ask Squat You Show. We're back in my office for another classroom edition of the show. Let's get to today's question.
Ellen writes, in PT school, I'm being taught that we should advocate squatting 60 to 90 degrees. We've talked about how squatting deep stresses medial meniscus and the ACL too much. I see the value in deep squatting, but have a hard time reasoning all the info.
Alright, so this is one of the most highly controversial subjects in all of training and fitness education. So, are deep squats really bad for your knees? Are they bad for your ACL? Are they bad for your meniscus? Well, let's talk about that today and set the bar straight finally. So, before we actually get into the specifics of all those different parts of the question, we need to take a trip back in history and talk about where this sort of whole idea was propagated from. When did it all start? Did we always think that deep squatting was bad for your knees, or is it something that sort of happened along the way? What were those sort of firing points for starting this whole thing, which I believe is a myth? So this is Squat History 101. Now, we're taking our trip back to the 1950s, and I want to introduce you to someone named Dr. Carl Klein. Now, he worked at a university in Texas, where he was working with a number of football players. Now, in response to seeing a large number of knee injuries, like a torn MCL, torn ACL, he thought that it was due to possibly the use of the deep squat in their training. Now, his idea was that in the deep squat, they were stretching out the ligaments, making their knees more loose or more hypermobile. And therefore, whenever they would come down to athletic competition, they would be more subjected to forces that could tear their ACL or MCL. So he developed this sort of crude, self-made device, and he tested the laxity or how loose their knee ligaments were. And based on the findings of his research, he concluded that athletes that used the deep squat had more loose or more laxity in their knees that allowed them to get injured. And he took these findings and said that every single person should only perform the barbell squat to a parallel depth. However, anyone that's ever done any research or reads a lot of research or is in the scientific community, you know that you just can't take one evidence or one or two articles of evidence and say, yes, this confirms our cause and effect relationship. One article or two articles saying that there's a relationship between increased range of motion at the knees, improved laxity with this device, with deep squatting, confirms that deep squatting automatically increases your risk of having an injury. However, that's what happens. Now, Dr. Klein's theory was eventually picked up by Sports Illustrated. In 1962, they ran an article that sort of took his theory and showed it to everyone. So now all of a sudden, you had people that would never read research that were reading that deep squats were bad for your knees. Again, based on these 1 and 2 different articles, research experiments that were done down in Texas. All of a sudden, that just sort of spread all over the world. So you had people knowing that deep squats were apparently bad for your knees that never would have before, and that changed the way we viewed the squat. All of a sudden, the American Medical Association came out with a position paper that cautioned against the use of deep squatting. You had the military, I believe it was the Marine Corps, stopped doing different exercises like the squat jump or something that had been in their physical conditioning programs, all of a sudden was taken out. You even had a superintendent of New York schools that cautioned against in PE classes, we need to completely take out the deep squat because it's going to be bad for our kids. So all of a sudden you had people all over the world that stopped deep squatting all because of Dr. Carl Klein's research. So that was back in the 1960s. Now, what have we learned since then? There's been a ton of biomechanical research that has come out. We've learned so much more about the knees and actually what happens in the bottom of a deep loaded squat. So let's take a trip now and let's talk about anatomy, biomechanics, what actually happens at the knee joint when we're in the bottom of the squat. Well, there's two big forces that act on the knee joint during a squat. One is shear force and the other is compressive force. Now, what is shear force? Shear force is the sliding force that acts to take one part of the knee and move it forward or backward on the other. Now, this is primarily opposed by the PCL and the ACL. So if you have a very high amount of shear force, it can tear the ACL. Now, you also have compressive force, and that's just like it sounds, two things smashing together. as you squat down, you have a ton of rising compressive force of the femur against the top of the tibia. Now, what we find is that you actually have sort of an inverse relationship. As you squat down, there is less and less shear force and more compressive force at the knee. So basically, the added compressive force has an inverse relationship to the amount of shear force. Now, yes, at the very, very bottom of a deep squat, when the knee is in a forward position, there is a high amount of shear force. However, there's also a ton of compressive forces. So what we find is that the compressive force of the femur on the tibia actually provides a safe place for the ACL. Your ACL is actually only maximally loaded at a very shallow depth, between 15 and 30 degrees of knee flexion. So a very shallow depth, that's where your ACL is maximally loaded. What that means is that you don't actually tear your ACL in the bottom of a deep squat. You tear it at a very small squat. So when people land from a jump, land from a cut, and try to move, they don't tear their ACL in a very deep knee bend position or a deep knee flexion position. They tear it at a very high position, because as you get down into a deep squat, there's a ton of compression that actually provides a little bit of safety to the knee joint and takes pressure off of the ACL. In fact, research has actually been done where they have actually tested the amount of pressure put on the ACL during a loaded back squat and found that at max, the ACL was loaded only up to 25% of its max tensile strength during a heavy back squat. So not even a fourth of what it is capable of handling during a back squat. The highest amount ever recorded on the PCL, same study, was only 50% of its max tensile strength. So what this means is that during a barbell squat to full depth, your ACL and PCL are very, very safe. There is not enough harmful forces placed on those ligaments to ever injure them. So to the first part of today's question, the ACL is not maximally loaded at the bottom of a deep squat. So in fact, that part of someone's education was very wrong. So like we talked about before, when you look at scientific research, you can't just take one article, one piece of evidence and say, for sure, this is cause and effect relationship. Everything we do has to be based on this one article. You need a lot of supporting evidence. So skip ahead a couple years after all of Dr. Klein's research came out in the 1950s, 70s, and 80s, people tried to replicate those articles. They made sort of the same crude self-made device as Dr. Carl Klein and tried to replicate his research. Except this time, they found the opposite results. They found that athletes who squatted deep compared to athletes that squatted to parallel, they didn't have any difference in the amount of laxity in their knees. They had the same stability in their knees. Skip ahead to 1986, another group of researchers took 3 groups of athletes. They took some weightlifters and powerlifters, they took some basketball players, and they took some runners. They said, weightlifters, go do squats for an hour, go train. They took the basketball players, they had them go train, play basketball for an hour or so. They took the runners, they said, go run a 10-kilometer race. They came back and tested their knee stability and found that the weightlifters and powerlifters who had been squatting heavy that whole time to full depth had actually more stability in their knees than the basketball players who had been playing basketball and the runners that had been running. So what we find through these other research articles is that in fact, deep squatting, barbell squatting has a protective effect on the knee joint and can improve knee stability, not decrease knee stability. So we disproved with all those subsequent articles that in fact, Dr. Carl Klein's research was not validated. It was not true. Deep squats are not as bad as previously thought. Now, the second part of today's question was about the meniscus. So, does deep squatting eventually erode the medial meniscus? Now, if this were true, we would see a high rate of weightlifters and powerlifters with arthritis in their knee joints, because there is a lot of compression that is placed on the knee joints whenever you squat deep. So as you squat deep, there is more compression against the femur and the tibia, which is supported and sort of offloaded by the meniscus. They're basically the bumper pads to your knee. There's a lot of research out there that shows that weightlifters and powerlifters that were on an elite level actually have no increase significantly rate of knee arthritis compared to you and me. The big reason for this, I believe, is because elite weightlifters and powerlifters use very good weightlifting programming. They have fluctuations in volume, intensity, and frequency. What that means is they allow their body to recover. If you're squatting at a very high frequency, volume and intensity over and over and over again, and you never allow your body to fully recover and you push through pain, for sure, that could be something that could eventually decrease the meniscus and harm it and cause you to develop a lot of arthritis. However, if you are smart about your training program, you're using fluctuations in volume training, intensity, and frequency, and you're not pushing through pain. In my opinion, squatting deep can be completely safe on your knee. So what's the takeaway for today? The big thing to understand is that for athletes with healthy knees and using good technique and good training programming with fluctuations in volume, frequency, and intensity, squatting deep or ass-to-grass can be completely safe and have no risk for damaging your meniscus or tearing your ACL. So I hope you guys liked today's Ask Squat You show. My question of the day, what are other myths that you have heard about squatting or just training in general that you would like me to cover on the Ask Squat You show? I hope you guys enjoyed today's classroom edition for the Ask Squat You show. If you did, please share it with your friends, like and comment today. I want to know your answers in the comment section below. Until next week, guys, happy squatting.
Hometown hero on the road doing shows and sold out arenas. You can call me what you want, but you won't ever slow my dreams up. This is the vision of a dreamer. I seem to